What went wrong for minorities is that the Amin government, over the course of the 70s, created more and more categories of people who they blamed for the ills of their time and who they targeted with violence and who they sought to displace from Uganda through acts like the expulsion of the Asian community, through the persecution of Langi and Acholi people, through the murder of the Archbishop in 1977, which was again cast as an effort to roll back the influence of plotters and schemers and others. Amin's government lost a lot of international credibility after 1977, February. The murder of the Archbishop, as everybody knows, was a kind of turning point in his reputation internationally. But within Uganda, Uganda had never been more prosperous than they were in 1977, 78.
Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Expulsion at 50, an oral history project created to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the expulsion of the Asian community from Uganda. My name is Dola Vasani. Back in March 2021, I spoke to Derek Peterson at the University of Michigan. In this podcast, he shares his deep interest and experience of working in Uganda, and in particular, his perspectives of the happenings of the 1970s. I hope you find his story interesting and insightful.
Tears got to fall. Now I'm getting. Why? Because of love. Oh yeah. I tell you, my friend, there's nothing as strong as love.
Perhaps we can start with hearing about how you first became interested in the history of Uganda.
In the 1990s, I was a newly graduated student and went off to East Africa, in Kenya in particular, and ended up kind of getting stuck in Kenya as a scholar over the course of time. I developed kind of an interest as a person, as a human being, and as a student in the history of literature and of religion. I made a lot of friends in Kenya, and I ended up writing a whole dissertation, which later became a book, about the history of language and of religion in central Kenya. It's a book that's called Creative Writing, and it's a study of how and why Kikuyu people in central Kenya over the course of 100 years reframed their language in response to changing political and religious and economic conditions. I finished this thing about Kenya. I realized, well, I'd like to know more about East Africa more generally. So I went off, I got interested in, as a person again, and as a scholar, in a Christian revivalist movement called the Balokole, known in English as the East African Revival, which was a 1930s movement of religious life, largely in Protestant Christianity, although some Catholics got attached to it as well, that was pan-East African in orientation. It was a revival that began in Uganda, but was very influential in the 1940s and 50s in Kenya, Tanzania, Sudan, Rwanda, and the Congo. And so I was interested in this movement because I'd met Balokole revivalists in central Kenya, Kikuyu-speaking revivalists, who saw themselves as part of this broader regional religious movement that I didn't know much about. So I decided I want to know more about this. That's what took me to Uganda. The Uganda, my interest in Uganda as a scholar, which later became a very deeply personal interest, was grounded in this kind of, this search to understand how and why East Africans in the mid-20th century created this cosmopolitan religious movement that worked against all of the conventions of culture and politics of their time. Revivalists refused to accept the premise that they were simply rooted within place and attached to locality and speakers of one language only. They were cosmopolitans, they traveled widely, They were often the first people to own bicycles in the places where they lived. They weren't highly educated people. They spoke local languages, but they were often multilingual simply because they wanted to be able to speak and preach and testify to other East Africans in a kind of evangelical way.
Tell us about how you came about preserving the archival materials in Uganda from the 1970s.
In the early 2000s, I was poking around Ugandan government archives and realized that a great amount of archival material, particularly in the provinces, was in a very bad state of preservation. And so a lot of papers, government papers in districts and provinces were kept in basements or in attics or in storage facilities and needed urgently to be attended to. So myself and colleagues at a number of different Ugandan universities started working together to find ways to preserve the papers of Uganda's local governments. I formed a particularly close attachment to friends and colleagues in Fort Portal at Mountains of the Moon University, which is a new local government university that's just been made a central government institution. We formed a relationship with funding from the United States that allowed us to digitize the district government records of Kabarole district and of Hoima district in the Northwest, and also the papers of the Toro Kingdom. And then around the same time, I started organizing teams of students from Michigan to put in order the papers, the physical papers. We didn't do digitization, but the physical papers of Kabale district, Jinja district, and other local government bodies, some of which were brought into the Uganda Central Government Repository in Kampala, others of which now live in district government headquarters. All of this made me realize that there was a lot of paper from the 1970s, actually. We often think that the Amin government was all about Amin's personal rule and his dictatorship. But in fact, local government authorities took their jobs very seriously, and they documented a lot of stuff in the 1970s. There are volumes and volumes of papers that shed light on the work that local authorities and local people did outside Kampala in the 1970s to kind of bring about a kind of form of government in Uganda's provinces. And that's what made me interested in the 1970s. It helped me see that the Amin state was not simply a projection of Amin's personal will or of his charisma or of his notoriety or of his appetites or whatever, which is how we often see it. Instead, the Amin state was a government in which people labored, civil servants labored, often with good intentions to bring about a modicum of order and progress and predictability about the work of government in the 1970s, a time of terrible violence and upset and loss for many people, but also a time in which many Ugandans found opportunities to thrive. According to diplomats who were in Uganda who knew about these things, they regarded Uganda's civil servants as among the best in Africa, in fact. They were well educated, committed. There was a civil service training college which kept a very close eye, offered continuing education courses. They were very professional, and they continued to do their work right through the 1970s, even in a time in which many of them found themselves subject to the unwelcome attention of men with guns.
So where does the expulsion of the Asians fit into the overall vision Idi Amin had for Uganda?
The Asian expulsion is part of the fabric of the 1970s in Uganda's public life. If you look at the expulsion from the vantage point of people who ended up in Canada or in Britain or in the United States, it looks like, a horrific human rights catastrophe, which it was. 50,000, 60, 70,000 people, the numbers are indistinct but there's tens of thousands of people ended up being deprived of their livelihoods, of their businesses, of their ways of life, of the communities they've been attached to. It's worth saying, though, that after the events of 1972, Amin carried on with what he called the economic war. So there was an ongoing campaign that followed after the expulsion of the Asians and that shaped Uganda's public life right through the 1970s. So it's not to say that the events of 1972 were not important, but it's also to say that there was a lot that happened after that that was sort of following on from the expulsion of this huge and important community of people. The economic war for Amin was a kind of, what do you call it? It was a framework in which to enact policy in a whole range of different areas of Uganda's public life in the years from 1972 forward. It was a way, first of all, of positioning Uganda at the forefront of the global war against neo-imperialism and racism. That's how Amin described it. So it was a credential, a kind of means of marshaling, of framing local policy in relation to what Amin described as a global war against the lingering vestiges of British imperialism in Africa. And right through the 70s, Amin lived on that reputation, on that self-positioning. He was constantly sort of explaining government policy as being about resisting British influence on Uganda's public life. There were other kind of follow-ons from the events of 1972. The effort to expel the Asians, among other things, was a template that the Amin government could use to direct the apparatus of the regime against other constituencies, other groups of people who were thought to be disposed against Amin's government and who were described as saboteurs or terrorists or guerrillas or, with other kinds of, so women who wore miniskirts, for example, or Tanzanians or the Luo or, Israelis or a whole range of other communities were, like the Asians, targeted in those years and made to answer for what the Amin regime described as their unpatriotic attachment to foreign sentiments. The Asian expulsion was the evidence that Amin needed to show that he was conducting a war against foreign influence in Uganda. And that in turn ramified right through the 70s and shaped government life, political life in a great number of ways.
No, I don't understand. What's love? I wanna know what life is now.
You're the co-author of the book, The Unseen Archives of Idi Amin. Can you tell us how this came about?
In 2019, we organized an exhibition at the Uganda Museum in Kampala, which featured a collection of photographs that had been kept in the archives of the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation. The UBC inherited tens of thousands of photographic negatives that had been made by Idi Amin's personal photographers in the 1970s. Now, about 40 or 50,000 of these negatives. That's what's given us the material with which to publish this book called The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin. And we organized a series of public events around the exhibition to call attention to it. Among them was a panel that we put together, which was meant to feature the stories of people who had been victimized in the 1970s. We put in the panel a Ugandan Asian who had stayed on after 1972. He stayed on for a couple of years. Alongside him on the panel were the daughter of the Archbishop of Uganda, who had been murdered in 1977, and the daughter of a government official from the South, who had also been murdered in the events of 1972. So there were two people on the panel who had suffered personal grief, the loss of relatives as the result of what happened in 1970, in the 1970s. Alongside the third member of the panel was this gentleman who's a businessman in the 1970s. And it's worth saying it was very difficult for us to know how to shuttle between these different experiences of loss. The South Asian businessman who spoke to the panel had actually prospered. He made money. The two other members of the panel had personal stories about the loss of their fathers in the hands of men with guns who had killed their fathers in many cases in very gruesome and public ways, and notorious ways, in fact, in the case of the Archbishop. As a businessman, a prosperous, kind of financier really of the Amin government, many Ugandans in the audience questioned him quite vigorously about his own kind of ethics, as you might expect. And it's worth saying the 1972 expulsion was hugely dehumanizing. It didn't involve, though, the great loss of life among Ugandan nations. And today, it's difficult to know how to center that experience of loss in Uganda and to make it part of the story of the 1970s, a time in which so many Ugandans lost personally individuals who were, killed in the most public ways. The expulsion of the Asian community in 1972 foretold a parallel and probably larger expulsion, not an expulsion, but an exiling of thousands of well-intentioned Ugandans who found themselves fleeing for their lives in the 70s as the Amin government became more and more violent.
People forget where they belong and go away with the people they love. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Lord, oh, please, Lord, tell me.
Uganda of the 1970s and of the Idi Amin years is so much more than the expulsion of the Asian community.
Edward Rugomayo went into exile in February 1973, right after the Amin government started executing people in public. He was a government minister in Amin's regime. He was a very accomplished and well-educated and idealistic and principled man. In February 1973, he goes into exile and says, this government is dehumanizing all of us. We have to find another way to organize public life. It was very courageous. He was the first of Uganda's government ministers to flee the country, and he took the decision. He kind of set out a path that a great many of other people were to follow in the years that followed him. Thousands of Ugandans ended up going to London or to Nairobi or to Dar es Salaam. I've been writing to some extent about the Ugandan exile community in the 1970s. And, they were, like the Uganda Asians, nostalgic about the homes that they'd lost, outraged about the state of their country, eager to bring about, a change in government, idealistic, in a way, unpragmatic, often bitterly divided. That one thing that emerges from the research and writing and collaborative kind of thinking I've been doing with colleagues in Uganda is that first, the Amin government was not irrational. Idi Amin's charisma was an important driving force in the 1970s. But as we were discussing earlier, there were a whole set of infrastructures that worked to reorient and shape Ugandans' understanding of where they stood in history. So there were museums and monuments, archives, and other kinds of arenas where the Amin government sought to define what it meant to be a patriotic person in their place and time. I think it's fair to say that the 1970s involved the demonization and targeting of lots and lots of racial and cultural minorities, including preeminently the Asian community, but also people from Langi and Acholi, who were the first to be targeted by the Amin's government in the months immediately after the coup. Thousands of people died in the hands of government officials, but there were also lots of people who were inspired by the time in which they lived, who devoted themselves to serve the cause that they felt that the Amin regime was holding out, who saw themselves as kind of patriotic citizens whose obligation was not to flee or to resist, but rather to help bring about a kind of a revolutionary moment in Uganda's public life. For a time, in the mid-70s, all that seemed possible. It's worth also saying that 1977, 78 were a time of considerable prosperity in Uganda. Coffee was really valuable. There was a frost in Brazil in 1975, 76. The price of coffee and tea on the international market went through the roof. Ugandan coffee was never more valuable than it was in the late 70s. Visitors who came to Kampala in 78 described that, people were prosperous, the city streets were well kept, it was orderly, there were flowers on the hedge, on the verges of the streets, everything was swept, it looked very good. The experience of the 1970s in Uganda was in some sense generic. It's not to say that every place in the world is going to become Idi Amin's Uganda. But as we've just seen here in the United States, and as I'm afraid colleagues in Britain are also seeing today, the kind of multiculturalism of the early 2000s, the Obama administration, the European Union project, the effort to build multicultural societies are always fragile. These are fragile undertakings. And in a time of economic tumult, I'm afraid that often racial populists enjoy opportunities that to mobilize people and to kind of concretize people's feelings of unhappiness and resentment, and to turn them into programs.
Dear Lord, what's love? What's love? No, I don't understand. What's love? I wanna know, baby. What's love? No, 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 no.
And what would you say has been the role of the media in shaping this discourse?
New media, Twitter in this case, is a very powerful means of shaping people's perception of the time in which they live, of identifying minorities as if they were to blame for amorphous social ills. It's a vehicle by which to harness resentment and to shape people's sense that they need to act in a way that overturns outsiders' control over our way of life, whoever we might be, whether white Americans or the British or whoever we're talking about. In the 1970s, likewise, as in Trump's America, Idi Amin had vehicles, media resources at his disposal that allowed him to target minorities. It's worth saying the expulsion of the Asian community was announced on radio. The radio station in Uganda was the most powerful broadcast medium in Africa in the early 1970s. Amin inherited a radio broadcasting service that had been built up by the Obote regime and that in the early 70s became extraordinarily powerful. There was a whole new array of broadcasting equipment in Soroti that Amin opened up. Ugandans used to call it government by radio announcement. The radio for Amin served the purpose that Twitter served for Donald Trump. That is, it was a vehicle by which to broadcast this singular voice of the president out across the landscape and to kind of, to issue orders and to orient public life and to inflame and to organize. So our own experience here in the United States with Twitter in these past few years has been kind of befuddlement. Like, how can you make policy on Twitter? And yet we've seen how, until earlier this year, Twitter acted as a kind of vehicle by which some Americans came to see themselves as standing in a direct relationship with a charismatic president whose power it was to concretize social ills and to name constituencies who were to blame for the Chinese flu, for instance. I think that that we can learn from the 1970s as global citizens about how racial populism works at the intersection of economic and racial resentment and around the infrastructures of new media. That's my take-home lesson.
So, Derek, are there any final thoughts you wish to share?
So first of all, I want to say that I hope that Ugandans will listen to this podcast. Uganda's public life today is largely empty of memorials to the events of the 1970s. There aren't places where people who suffered grief in those days can come to understand what happened to them. There aren't civic institutions that honor the dead. There aren't memorials or museums where people can come and mourn and learn and discuss. Public acknowledgement of what happened to the Asian community, to Langi and Acholi people, to people from Ankole and other parts of Uganda who suffered tremendously in those years. And so in the absence of a memorial infrastructure, enterprises like this one are really important. They can give people who suffered a chance to kind of place what happened to them within a context, to grapple with it, to think about it, and more generally, for Ugandans today to learn about what happened, because frankly, so many Ugandans have been born since April 1979. Something like 80% of Ugandans were not alive in April 1979. It's one of the youngest places in the world. And, it's important to keep the memory of this very recent history alive as a means of instruction, frankly, and education.
I wanna know what's love. Yeah. What's love?
Thank you for listening to Derek's story. Do share it with your friends and family. Hope you'll join me for episode 23 out on the 1st of December 2021.